Welcome back to On the Flip Side. My name is Adam Shawalker, your host. Today we're going to be covering industrial rock album Trait by Pailhead. Came out in 1988. You've got essentially this mix of Al Jourgensen's Ministry type industrial beats with Minor Threat's Ian MacKaye on vocals. This is the sole EP that they have ever released. We are going to be reviewing the 2019 remaster. It does have a slightly different track listing as compared to the original vinyl release. It's actually a lot more in line with the original cassette and CD release. That track listing being Man Should Surrender, Anthem, Don't Stand in Line, Ballad, I Will Refuse, No Bunny, and then a dub remix of Don't Stand in Line. The dub remix was not included in the original releases of either the vinyl or the CD or the cassette. It is only on this remaster here. So, without further ado, let's get into it and we'll see you on the flip side. Alright, so we're back with side one of the record. We've got Man Should Surrender, Anthem, Don't Stand in Line, and Ballad. First track on the album, Man Should Surrender, kicks off the record with a tight drum and bass loop with a very punchy bass line. You can immediately place the era of industrial this came from just based off of the tones that they're using on this track, be it the guitar or the drums or the bass, and just the production in general on this album. Ian MacKaye's vocal delivery is really perfectly fitting on this track, almost spitting his lyrics like a rap flow in certain sections. Al Jourgensen ends up like spitting the chorus of the song and other lyrics behind Ian MacKaye's vocal delivery as well. And the energy of this track is maintained pretty much through the length of the entire song. But you can definitely tell this track in this era of Pailhead and Al Jourgensen's work, 1988 that is. Most of these instrumental tracks sound like they could have come off of either Ministry's The Land of Rape and Honey or even the album that came the next year in 1989, The Mind is a Terrible Thing to Taste. Both of those records could have probably used some of these instrumentals had they not been used here. Second track on the album is Anthem. It opens with like this squealing guitar that immediately is like utilized as some sort of alarm or like klaxon with this sort of groovy drum track going behind it. The instruments like ramp back up into this beat that is like weirdly reminiscent of Enter Sandman, although like 3 years early. Like it's the same tempo and almost the same delivery along with the bass and the drums, and it's something that I hadn't noticed before until this listen, but it's some weird reminiscence there. Ian's vocals on this track are pretty drawn out and a bit despondent, sort of emulating groups like Joy Division, and it amps up occasionally for some more intense vocals that are more in line with like the hardcore punk background that Ian is from. The aggression on this track sort of increases steadily throughout the length of the track as well, and a lot of the vocal lines on this thing are delivered almost like in a slam poetry kind of way as well. Third track on the record we have is Don't Stand in Line. We get like another one of these like familiar feedback guitar intros that's pretty common in a lot of industrial music into a very hard grooving instrumental on this entire EP. It's probably one of the grooviest sections. Grinding like guitars kind of carry this melody on this track with Ian working with some really good industrial sensibilities on this one as well. Paul Barker, the bass player, keeps the track incredibly level along with the drums and pretty much holds everything tight. The fourth track on the record is Ballad. Kicks off with a sampled phone call and then a sustained series of guitar notes. The track kind of immediately catches the attention just with these like voicemail messages that sort of carry the theme of the track as well. It's also kind of reminiscent of some Revolting Cocks stuff that would come out a bit later on if you'd listen to like Beer, Steers, and Queers. The whole voicemail sampling thing seems to be a continuous trend that Al Jourgensen has used over the years. Ian's delivery on this track is once again initially pretty slow with some sort of off-tone notes that help emphasize different parts of the track. The track itself seems to like revolve a bit around like drugs, money, etc., and living like a bum. There are sections of this track where Ian is sort of like channeling this like Henry Rollins era Black Flag punk delivery, and it works really well on this track. So that is the first 4 tracks of the album and the first side of the album. We will come back to you with side 2, and we'll see you on the flip side. Alright, we've got side 2 of the record here. First track off of side 2, track 5 on the entire EP is I Will Refuse. The track immediately starts up with like a high tempo bass line here. The scales here kind of climb up the neck of the bass up to like this higher note and then drop back down, and it just repeats this over and over again. All of this is sort of accented by like kick drums and sampling behind this bass track as well. Ian's vocals here are introduced slowly over the course of like the first minute or two of the track, and it builds up a bunch of tension as well, and then it kind of all drops the hammer at once and then kicks into like this hardcore punk segment, or even like a thrashy segment as well. Some of the portions of this track as well kind of come off as almost bluesy just because of Ian MacKaye's vocal delivery on certain points. He's like crooning in some segments. It's really weird, but it works really well here. The heavy segments sort of recede and head back to the original segment for a brief moment, only to go back up to the hardcore punk segments. And I could really see this track kind of playing over some like old like skateboarding VHS videos with like a fisheye lens or something, doing like kick flips. It's a bit of a dated track style-wise, but I think it caught like a really nice era of this like punk industrial that can fit really well with like certain aspects of the era, like hardcore punk and skating. Sixth track on the album is No Bunny. So more feedback and more of this like reverbed out drum lines as well as like tight bass start this track off. And it's a lot like the first track on the album, whereas the backing track here is pretty much going to stay same throughout the entire song, pretty consistently, with some guitar being like the only real deviation here. The guitar is pretty much the only instrument on this track that is going to change anything up. It fits in with the vocals and sampling on this track as well. The midpoint of the track has some more like sampling that are almost voicemail-like. They might have used Ian MacKaye's voice here for this with some kind of filter over it to make it sound more like it was captured over like a phone or something. But it's like more of this weird like offbeat slam poetry type stuff. It's, you know, the message isn't super clear, but it accents the track well. I suspect they might just be plugging Ian MacKaye's vocals just through like some kind of vocal processor or something. The last track on the record, and I believe the first release of this dub mix for Don't Stand in Line, it really immediately kicks off a lot more intensely and just sort of leaves you right in the thick of it right off the bat. I'd argue that this version is a lot groovier as well, honestly. I think that it's got a much bigger sound than the original mix. When it comes to like remixes, you really don't have to look any further than Al Jourgensen for quality of remixes and quantity. Like, this guy was like, pretty much every version of every one of his albums has some kind of remix version of damn near every song on those albums. And they come off not as like, you know, oh, here's just more stuff, but it like, each of the songs that this guy remixes and remasters are almost like, they're almost worthy of their own coverage in their own right, just in that they're usually so different from the original material. Yeah, so any of these new remixes are pretty much examples of their own songs, and this is a good example of that in its own regard. As for final thoughts on the record, Pailhead was one of these Al Jourgensen once-off projects where it's really like mostly ministry, and then they'll get like a guest singer in. It's a lot similar to like 1,000 Homo DJs or Acid Horse or PTP or Revolting Cocks. It's just kind of Al Jourgensen and company doing another project. Back in like the early 80s, like Al Jourgensen was involved with so many different musical camps. At certain points they would just, you know, hang out, record an album's worth of material and think, well, we can't really tour this, but we want to release it, so what do? And it's like, well, we need a band name. It's like, all right, Pailhead, throw it out, release it as Pailhead. And it would also provide material to release under the Wax Trax label, which is why there are so many Al Jourgensen related Wax Trax pressings, because he also, I believe, did cutting and mixing for them at the time for other bands that were on their label. So as someone who did a lot of that work, you know, you can put your own music out, no problem. The actual quality of this record itself, I'd say, is pretty top-notch for the era. 1988 is pretty much prime industrial rock territory for Al Jourgensen. It is the base point for the starting point of bands like Nine Inch Nails, who would release Pretty Hate Machine the year after this came out. And it's in like the thick of Skinny Puppy and Ogre and all of these other industrial rock projects that are all happening at the same time. This album is definitely worthy of standing up there with the rest of them, despite these very big hardcore punk directions that this album goes, as well as on top of this industrial like territory. It's interesting in its own right, and I think if you haven't listened to Pailhead before, give this album a listen. It's the only thing they ever put out, so it's pretty quick to listen to. This album's maybe half-hour long tops. Have you listened to this record? Leave your thoughts on it in the comments. What should I review? How am I doing? I have more videos in the works. We will get those up as soon as we can. Other than that, see you on the flip side.